Essex is a beautiful ancient land with a dark and brutal past. This expansive county in the southeast of England boasts a fascinating and rich history, marked by its ancient forests, extensive marshes, and winding inlets of the North Sea and the Thames estuary. But Essex is known as the Witch County, with hundreds of men, women and children affected by a series of notorious Essex witch trials in the 16th and 17th centuries. Witchcraft, the alleged use of the supernatural or magic to control people or events, was a frightening concept, and the social and religious climate in Essex created the perfect conditions for accusations to spread. Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled witchfinder, and his reign of terror saw quiet villages descend into chaos with devastating consequences. The hysteria, fear, hatred and superstition he preyed on have left unfortunate victims to roam as tortured wraiths whose restless souls still remain. Stories of phantom witches, cunning men, familiars and strange tales of witchcraft are found throughout the county even to this day. Welcome to the ghosts of the Essex witches. St Osyth is a picturesque village in Essex, but within its historic boundaries is a building with a sinister secret. Famous for its medieval charm and serene landscapes, St Osyth is also home to the Cage, a former prison with a reputation for being one of the most haunted locations in the UK. With over 4 centuries of grisly history, the Cage has become a hotspot for paranormal enthusiasts and historians alike. Its notoriety as a haunted building is supported by countless reports of paranormal activity. Residents, visitors and paranormal investigators have experienced a wide range of unusual occurrences, including disembodied voices and shadowy figures, sudden drops in temperature, and physical sensations, including being touched, pushed and violently attacked by unseen forces. The Cage served as a jail, but also as a quarantine room for plague victims, and possibly as a morgue. But the Cage's most famous inmate and resident ghost is that of Ursula Kemp, who was held here accused of being a witch. In 1582, the village of St Osyth became the scene of a notorious witch trial. 3 years earlier, Queen Elizabeth I had visited St Osyth's Priory, where she reprimanded the local justices of the peace for failing to pursue cases of witchcraft. Whether this directly influenced the trials of 1582, we do not know, but it certainly added to the climate of fear in which these tragic events unfolded. 14 women were accused of witchcraft, with 2 eventually being executed. The case began with Ursula Kemp, a woman with little financial means, who made a living as a nursemaid and midwife. Ursula had a reputation for counteracting curses from those who thought they were being attacked by black magic, a practice that often led to suspicion in these times. Problems began with a local lady named Grace Thurlow, whose son, Davy, had been ill. Ursula had treated the child, and it was reported that she cured Thurlow's son by using incantations. When he recovered, Ursula believed she would be hired as a nursemaid for Grace's newborn daughter. But when Grace refused to appoint her, their relationship became strained. Shortly after, Grace's baby girl, Joan, fell from her cradle and broke her neck. Rather than accepting the fatality as an accident, Grace blamed Ursula, convinced she had used witchcraft in revenge. Ursula had a history of quarrels with women in her village, and accusations followed, since this was one of the easier ways to get back at somebody in a small community during this time. She was also accused of the death of Elizabeth, the daughter of a local lady named Alice Leatherdale. Alice had refused to lend Ursula some cleaning materials, and Ursula was seen muttering or murmuring in her direction. Shortly afterwards, Elizabeth became ill and died. It seems it was clearly a case of causing death by bewitchment. The dispute saw Ursula reported to the authorities, and she was imprisoned to await trial at the Chelmsford Assize Court. The court case was chaired by Brian Darcy, a wealthy landowner from St Clair's Hall, who just happened to be Grace Thurlow's employer. Whilst awaiting trial and being interrogated over false accusations of witchcraft, Ursula was incarcerated in the cage. This notorious lockup, where drunks and villains would be kept overnight, doubled as a form of public humiliation as well as confinement. She was tried for witchcraft in Chelmsford in February 1582. Darcy was determined to secure a conviction. He obtained a damning testimony from an unlikely source, Ursula's 8-year-old son, Thomas. The child testified against his mother, claiming that she had 4 familiars, 2 cats, a black toad and a lamb. He testified, probably under duress, that he had seen his mother give her familiars beer and cake and let them feed from her body. Darcy manipulated Ursula, guaranteeing leniency if she confessed. Ursula, fully believing his assurances of freedom, admitted to practicing witchcraft, but instead of receiving mercy, Darcy condemned her to death. As was common in witch trials, once Ursula had confessed, she was forced to implicate others. She named 4 women, and in turn these women named 9 more. Ursula Kemp and Elizabeth Bennet were found guilty and sentenced to hang. Ursula was convicted of murder by witchcraft, having supposedly caused the death of Grace Thurlow's baby, Joan. And Elizabeth Bennet was accused of killing 4 people using sorcery and was said to have 2 familiars. The fate of the other convicted women is unclear. Ursula Kemp was hanged in Chelmsford in 1582. In 1921, the skeletons of 2 women were found in a St Osyth garden by Charles Brooker whilst he was carrying out some building work. One is believed to be that of Kemp, and both had iron rivets driven into their knees and elbows, a common method of stopping witches rising from the grave. The witches' skeletons became a local tourist attraction with an admission charge to view them. Today, the cage is a private residence, but it remains a symbol of misery and injustice. Its walls seem to reverberate with the anguish and despair of its former inmates, or even the collective energy of those captors who tortured and tormented innocent victims. The cage is said to be haunted by the ghost of Ursula Kemp herself. Residents and visitors have described seeing a woman in old-fashioned clothing either wandering the halls or standing in one of the rooms, and sometimes she is heard weeping. She has also been seen looking out of an upstairs window. This apparition was witnessed from outside of the building by a removals man who believed the property to be empty. Other apparitions include figures of children and shadowy shapes moving through the building. It is possible that children were held here during the witch trials to scare them into testifying in the preferred direction of the judge. The ghost of a young girl has been seen peering out of one of the windows. This apparition is thought to be connected to a child's skull discovered buried beneath the house during renovations in the 1900s. Even on very warm days, the cage is consistently cold. Residents have experienced sudden physical contact, being touched, having their hair pulled sharply, and being physically pushed by an invisible force. And is Ursula responsible for the poltergeist activity at the cage? Objects, including furniture, inexplicably move. Doors open and close, their handles shake furiously, and taps turn on by themselves. Vanessa Mitchell, a previous owner of the cage, has described some of the strange activity at the property. She bought the cage in 2004, and although she was aware of its haunted reputation, she felt it was simply a quaint cottage. But during her time at the cage, she reported numerous encounters and disturbing events. Vanessa saw 3 different apparitions on different occasions. Objects, including a can of Coke, would be thrown across a room. Vanessa watched ornaments move independently, witnessed glasses smashing, and experienced a large human-shaped black mist or fog that would glide through closed doors and hover menacingly. Her experiences were so extreme that she asked her friend Nicole to move in, but the activity failed to cease. Instead, it intensified. Nicole worked locally in a pub and was aware of the cage's haunted reputation. She heard rumours that the son of a previous resident had somehow become possessed in his bedroom and had set his room on fire. Both discovered that personal possessions would go missing, only to appear in bizarre locations elsewhere in the property. The sounds of children laughing, whispering and crying would fill the house and were particularly disturbing. Disembodied voices, from whispers to clear, coherent sentences, often in an old-sounding dialect, startled those who visited, and the smell of pipe smoke and freshly baked bread would often permeate through the building with no logical source. Exasperated, the women contacted a local vicar who agreed to bless the house, but this had little to no effect. In time, Nicole moved out and Vanessa had a son of her own in 2007. When she witnessed the apparition of a man close to her sleeping baby, Vanessa decided to sell. A priest once refused to re-enter the cage, claiming he was overwhelmed by spiritual darkness whilst he attempted to exorcise the property. One medium carried out an investigation and described the cage as thick with injustice and captured EVPs stating, "They lied, burn her," and "still waiting." In a 2003 renovation, a rusted old manacle was found hidden under floorboards. This probably restrained prisoners in the 1600s, and after it was discovered, the physical attacks, including scratches and claw marks, significantly increased. After selling, Vanessa Mitchell stated, "I honestly believe the house is cursed. I have lived there for years, but for me, seeing a tall dark figure standing between me and my son's cot was the final straw. I rented the house out to 2 tenants. One stayed for 3 months and one stayed for 5 months. They said exactly the same thing, that it was haunted. I went to multiple estate agents over the years, but none of them could sell it. Some were telling me to sell it at an auction for a much lower price. I did not ask for this. It broke me, and I left everything behind to escape it." After 12 years on the market, the cage was finally sold in 2020. It went back on the market just 4 years later, after a former owner said she was shoved to the floor by an unknown force whilst heavily pregnant. The cage's history of witchcraft and incarceration continues to cast a dark shadow, with many believing the restless spirits of the unjustly accused still linger within its walls. Canewdon is a village and civil parish in the Rochford district of Essex, and is sometimes referred to as the Village of Witches. Its location, on one of the highest hills of the Essex coastline, was favourable for its vantage point and proximity to the sea for trading and salt production. East of the village lies the island of Wallasey, popular for sailing and a wetland sanctuary for wildlife. But this village, close to Southend-on-Sea, has a long history of witchcraft dating back to the 15th century and paranormal activity connected to the local church. Canewdon is somewhat isolated, surrounded by the mudflats and marshes of the Thames estuary. It is easy to imagine how remote and insular the community must have been in the past. Its dominant landmark is St Nicholas's Church, built in the 14th century, which has sweeping views of the Crouch estuary. Its impressive 15th century tower was added later, a landmark visible for many miles, and it is said to have been erected on the order of Henry V, following his victory at the Battle of Agincourt in France. In the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the tower was used as a navigation point along the River Crouch, and in the First World War the tower was used for observation and as a signalling post. The village lockup, an old wooden shack with iron-barred windows, is located east of the church. It was built in 1775 and contains a pair of stocks. Lockups were buildings that were fairly common in villages throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, for temporarily holding those drunken and disorderly, thieves and petty criminals. The legend of the dark history of Canewdon dates back to the establishment of a coven of witches in the 15th century who used to meet in the grounds of the church. It is believed that as long as the Tower of St Nicholas stands, there will be 6 witches living in the village, and at one time the wife of the local clergyman was said to be one of the coven. Legend says that every time a stone falls from the tower of St Nicholas's Church, one witch dies, but another takes its place. Those who walk around the tower 3 times at midnight will conjure up witches and be forced to dance with them. An old churchwarden told visitors in the 1950s that simply walking around the church alone at midnight would make ghosts and witches appear. Variations of this legend seem to have developed over time, such as a ghost will appear at the top of the tower if you run 3 times backwards around the church. If you walk around the church anti-clockwise 7 times on Halloween, you will see a witch. If you do the same thing 13 times, you will vanish. And this is why, on Halloween, the police cordon off the entire area. Canewdon's earliest documented accusation of witchcraft appears to be that of Rose Pye, a spinster who was said to be living as a witch and responsible for bewitching to death a child in June 1580. Joanna Snow, a 12-month-old baby from Scaldhurst Farm, was the daughter of Richard Snow, a local tailor in Canewdon. The case went to the assizes in July 1580, where Rose pleaded not guilty. Although acquitted, Rose remained and died in jail a few months later, probably because she was unable to pay the fee needed to secure her release. Rose's apparition is said to haunt her burial site at the nearby crossroads, where she rises up and walks across the water of the River Crouch. Five years later, Cecily Makin was accused of witchcraft and was unable to find 5 people who would swear she was not a witch. After being given 5 years to mend her ways, without success, Cecily was excommunicated from the church, which meant that upon death, her soul would suffer everlasting torment and be unable to rest. In the 17th century, rumours spread that the Canewdon witches were so formidable that Witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins deliberately steered clear of the village in fear of its evil residents. However, this may be due to Canewdon's remote location, or that the locals couldn't afford his extortionate fee, or didn't want to anger the local coven of witches. In the 1800s, the Canewdon witches were blamed for terrorising the local villagers in numerous ways. They were said to have inflicted plagues of lice and parasites upon their enemies, caused illness, prevented cartwheels from turning, and caused farm machinery to break. Many of the alleged witches of Canewdon were old women, living alone, who kept white mice as pets. But rumours swirled that these were aids, familiars or imps. And then there's the story of the local blacksmith, who became a witch when he sold his soul to the devil, and he was given white mice as familiars. When he reached the end of his life, he confessed in fear on his deathbed that he could not die until he had passed on his powers to a successor. All of his mice climbed up on the bed and sat before him as he spoke. His wife refused to keep them, but finally he was able to persuade his daughter to accept them, and then he died. It was a deep-rooted belief that every coven of witches had to be under the control of a male, known as the Master of the Witches, and this applied to the Canewdon witches too. During the late 19th century, Canewdon's Master of the Witches was a farm labourer named George Pickingill, who along with his wife, Mary Ann, and children moved to Canewdon sometime between 1864 and 1868. He lived in an old cottage close to the Anchor pub, just a short walk from the church, and he worked as a farm labourer. Believed to be a hereditary witch from a line dating back to the 11th century, he performed many of the same services as other cunning folk, such as providing herbal remedies and finding lost objects, but he was also believed to have used darker, sinister forces to curse people and stop agricultural machinery, sometimes using his blackthorn stick as an aid. He was renowned for his control of animals, particularly horses, and legend has it that he could work at a superhuman rate, possibly with the aid of his imps or familiars. Apparently, he would sit by his hedge and smoke his pipe while an army of imps ploughed his field in half the time it would have taken men. At harvest time, Pickingill was known to wander around the local farms, threatening to bewitch farm machinery, with many farmers thus offering him beer so that he would leave them alone. But it is believed that George may have made some bold statements. He claimed to be the master of witches to 9 covens across a number of counties, including Hampshire, Hertfordshire, Norfolk and Sussex, and claimed that he could make 9 secret witches declare themselves simply by whistling. He allegedly struck a rival witch, causing his death, and this added to the fear the villagers of Canewdon had for him. Pickingill died in 1909, around the age of 93, and in the last few weeks of Pickingill's life, he had become very ill. Against his will, the local people moved him to the infirmary, where, bitterly, he declared that at his funeral there would be one more demonstration of his magical powers. Many locals interpreted this as coming true when, as the hearse carrying his coffin drew up to the church, the horses stepped out of their harnesses and bolted down the lane. His body was subsequently buried at the church in an unmarked grave, whilst his abandoned house next to the pub, the Anchor Inn, gradually became dilapidated before eventually falling down. Several ghost stories are linked to Canewdon, reinforcing the village's haunted reputation. Most sightings occur in the vicinity of the church porch, graveyard and West Gate car park. The witches at Canewdon were well known for their ability to puncture the tyres of anyone going to the village by bicycle. It is not uncommon for vehicles and bicycles to be discovered with punctures after the owners have visited the church, despite nobody else being around. The most frequently seen apparition is that of a lady dressed in either grey or blue, wearing a poke bonnet but with no face, and she has been seen floating only on moonless nights from the church's west gate down to the River Crouch. Some say this is the ghost of Eliza, a young local girl who was accused of witchcraft in the 1600s. She was snatched from her family by suspicious locals and imprisoned in the church cellar and burned in secret. Her angry apparition is said to haunt the south side of the church, where she is heard screaming. Another legend says that any woman who visits the churchyard at Canewdon and feels a hand on her shoulder will gain a mysterious power called the sight, which is the ability to see spirits. But in order to receive this supernatural gift, she will suffer great loss first. Another story refers to a mysterious headless ghost seen in the churchyard who has the strength to physically lift unwary victims and deposit them in a nearby ditch. Nobody is quite sure who this may have been in life, but it is believed to be one of the witches who met a grisly end. Back in the 1980s, witnesses reportedly saw a small humanoid demon running down the central street just as fast as a man fleeing on his motorbike. A young man riding his motorbike on Lark Hill Road encountered a luminous figure standing still in the centre of the road. Although the head was shrouded in mist, he was convinced he'd seen the ghost of a Canewdon witch. The landlord of the Plough and Sale pub in Pagglesham was driving home through Canewdon when he had an interesting encounter. He stated, "Something black with staring eyes loomed up out of the darkness in front of my car. There is only one way to describe what I saw. It was a witch." Canewdon has a ghostly farmer who is seen walking from the village hall towards the nearby fields before vanishing. Could this be George Pickingill himself, still lingering, still keeping watch over Canewdon, the village of witches? And the nearby Anchor Inn is also said to be haunted. The pub dates back to the 16th century, and for a time it operated as a coaching inn, serving travellers along the old Roman road between London and the Essex coast. Legend has it that this pub is haunted by the ghost of a young woman called Sarah. There are two versions of the story of Sarah at the Anchor Inn. The first is that she worked at the pub, was accused of witchcraft by the villagers, and hanged illegally close to the inn. Her body was then buried at a nearby crossroads in an unmarked grave. The second version is that at some point in the late 1500s, Sarah became pregnant after having an affair with a wealthy landowner. After the landowner's wife found out, she ordered for Sarah to be locked in a building, which became the Anchor Inn. Sarah was either murdered or died giving birth, but her ghost is reported to still haunt the building. Both visitors and staff have reported smelling unexplained perfume, heard a woman and baby crying, sensed children playing in the restaurant, and witnessed items fly. A regularly reported occurrence is the sound of heavy footsteps on the creaky floorboards of the upper floors when no one is present. Kitchen staff working in the pub have witnessed knives travelling across the work surfaces, and in various rooms, TV remote controls have been thrown with force. The inn's bar area is said to be haunted by a former landlord who took his last breath on the premises. And guests have reported glasses moving on their own and feeling they are being watched. Some are convinced that this is the work of George Pickingill, responsible for poltergeist activity and creating an oppressive feeling. In 1921, the famous ghost hunter Elliot O'Donnell visited Canewdon, where he observed a floating orb of blue light gliding through the church's gravestones. He described Canewdon as having an overwhelming presence of psychic disturbance. In 1563, during the reign of Elizabeth I, an act was passed against witchcraft. The act provided that anyone who should use, practice or exercise any witchcraft, enchantment, charm or sorcery whereby any person shall happen to be killed or destroyed was considered guilty of a felony without benefit of clergy and was to be executed. And it was Essex that became the focus for some of the first large-scale trials in the latter half of the 16th century. But in the 1640s, the trials would become even more intense, fuelled by one of the most famous names in witch hunting history, Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled witch-finder general, whose apparition and those of his victims still haunt several locations in Essex, particularly in Manningtree and Misley. Matthew Hopkins took full advantage of the political and religious chaos that reigned throughout the period of the English Civil Wars. He was highly aware that the conflict created an atmosphere of fear and turmoil, dividing families, villages and regions. Many steadfastly believed that witches were helping the royalist cause and that their magic was a symbol of God's anger. Poor harvests, widespread poverty and local rivalries between landowners and neighbours meant times were tough and it was easier to blame someone else for your own misfortune. Small, rural villages bred gossip, grudges and suspicion. Established legal systems were in turmoil, with regular judicial structures interrupted by the conflict, so local communities looked to Hopkins and his associate, John Stern, to eradicate witches for a significant fee. As a Puritan, he appeared to view witchcraft as a threat or assault on his religious values, and he subsequently targeted widows, healers, and women who expressed their opinions, those who had something unusual in their appearance or even a disability, and particularly those who lived on the fringes of society. Many were dependent on parish relief and were disliked by the locals who had to meet the cost of keeping them. Hopkins was never a government official, but between 1644 and 1647, his methods led to more executions for witchcraft than in the previous 100 years combined. Hopkins utilised an array of brutal and blatantly dubious methods to investigate cases of witchcraft, and some were taken directly from King James's bestseller, Demonology. Whilst the methods were significantly less violent than those adopted in mainland Europe, they did include keeping the suspect awake for days on end, causing sleep deprivation, and subsequently being coerced into confessing to almost anything. Although torture was nominally unlawful in England, Hopkins and more commonly his assistants pricked for devil's marks on the accused's body and considered common moles, birthmarks and scars as proof of a pact with Satan. The accused would be pricked in these areas with needles or pins, convinced this was a witch's mark and would therefore not bleed. Additionally, a witch would not feel pain. It was believed that the witch's familiar, an animal such as a cat or a dog, would be nurtured from such a mark. According to Hopkins's book, The Discovery of Witches, Hopkins began his career as a witch-finder after he overheard women discussing their meetings with the devil in March 1644 at the Thorn Inn in Misley. Hopkins moved to Manningtree, Essex, a town on the River Stour. According to tradition, Hopkins used his recently acquired inheritance of 100 marks to establish himself as a gentleman and to buy the Thorn Inn. Today, the Thorn Inn is an elegant and calm restaurant and hotel, but this area was the epicentre of mass hysteria many centuries ago. The Misley Thorn we see today was built in 1723 on the site of Hopkins's own Thorn Inn, which became his residence and from where he began his relentless vendetta against those accused of witchcraft. It was from here that Hopkins increased his influence among the county's social climbers and political elite, including top commanders from the parliamentary forces. It is believed that Hopkins interrogated his victims at locations such as Colchester Castle and the Thorn Inn, and his ghost, wearing his distinctive 17th century clothing, has been seen in broad daylight walking across the hotel's upstairs landing, and guests have complained of being woken up in the night by a strange presence. He has also been seen sitting in a chair in the attic before standing up and walking away. A man dressed in distinctive Puritan clothing, sometimes holding a quill or a scroll, has been witnessed descending the staircase before vanishing in the bar area. Maybe this is Hopkins himself, and several bartenders have reported the sounds of heavy boots echoing behind them as they work. One member of staff quit when she saw the ghostly man's reflection in a mirror staring at her. The distinct sounds of footsteps are heard coming from empty rooms, and those who've witnessed him describe him as truly lifelike. But there are more apparitions at the Thorn, including the apparition of a serving girl who roams the corridors. At the rear of the hotel there used to be stables, and it is said that the ghost of a young boy who, during a play fight, was deliberately pushed under a horse and cart and was trampled to death haunts this area of the Thorn. A grey hooded lady is also seen here, and this is thought to be one of Hopkins' interrogators. During renovations, a long needle was found hidden behind some bricks in the oldest part of the building. Whether this is indeed a witch pin used to prick the accused, we don't know, but it was sealed up in a case behind reception. Since its discovery, an array of strange things have happened in close proximity, including electrical surges, temperature drops, and glasses smashing. On one evening, the glass case shattered for no apparent reason. Another pub that is said to be haunted by Hopkins is the Red Lion. This Grade 2 listed building is the oldest pub in Manningtree, dating back to 1605, before the time of Matthew Hopkins and his witch trials. A spiritualist group in Misley held a séance here, and apparently the apparition of Hopkins made an appearance. He was described as wearing dark clothes, no hat, holding a cane, with dark oily hair, glittering eyes, and a small beard and moustache. He appeared for just a few seconds before disappearing. The first victim of Matthew Hopkins was Elizabeth Clark, an 80-year-old widow with one leg from Manningtree, whose mother had been hanged as a witch. Elizabeth was accused of witchcraft by John Rivet, who claimed that his wife had been cursed with lameness around Christmas of 1644, and that she'd brought misfortune to the community. After consulting a cunning woman in Hadley, Rivet was told that his wife had been cursed by two women who were their neighbours. Elizabeth Clark was dragged from the Red Lion pub in Manningtree by a mob and brought before Sir Harbottle Grimston, a local magistrate and landowner, who decided that she should be put on trial for witchcraft. Hopkins, alongside his associate John Stern, took charge of the investigation, subjecting Clark to brutal interrogation methods. Elizabeth was deprived of food and sleep for 3 consecutive nights, but on the 4th night of her torture, she weakened and confessed to being a witch, at the same time implicating 5 other women in witchcraft. Her confession alleged that she kept and nourished 5 familiars: a white kitten, a fat spaniel, a black rabbit, a polecat, and a long-legged greyhound with a head like an ox, whose name was Vinegar Tom. According to Hopkins, 8 people swore they had seen Clark with these familiars. Clark's confession generated a wave of accusations, eventually leading to 35 women being arrested and imprisoned on charges of witchcraft. The trials of the accused took place in Chelmsford on the 29th of July, 1645, and resulted in 29 people being condemned. 15 of the accused were executed in Chelmsford and its neighbouring vicinity, including Elizabeth Clark, who had to be helped to a height where the noose could be placed around her neck. But the ghost of Elizabeth Clark is said to walk the shoreline of Seafield Bay, and other disturbing cries are said to be those of her familiars desperately searching for her. Reports of mysterious, ghastly screams of an unlucky victim undergoing interrogation are sometimes heard from the opposite shore of the River Stour in Manningtree, and sometimes these disembodied voices are heard cursing Hopkins himself. Another location said to be haunted by Matthew Hopkins himself is known as the Hopping Bridge, which spans the waters of Misley Pond. It was known as the Ducking Pond, and this is where Matthew Hopkins allegedly tested the witches of Misley and Manningtree with the swimming test. Based on the belief that witches rejected baptism, suspects were thrown into water with their hands and feet, and sometimes arms and legs, tied together. If they floated, they were guilty and executed after trial. If they sank, they were innocent. The concept was simple. With your hands and feet bound, you were entirely at the mercy of the water, unable to save yourself by swimming or climbing out. When you were baptised and accepted God, you were anointed with water. However, when you began engaging in witchcraft and making devilish pacts, you rejected God. Consequently, the water would not accept you, causing you to float, and you may even have been assisted by your familiars. If you hadn't engaged in witchcraft, the water would still accept you, causing you to sink. Either way, the outlook was certain death. Some say that at the end of his reign of terror in 1647, Hopkins was himself ducked in this pond and then executed, but this is not true. Hopkins died of natural causes, probably tuberculosis, at his home in 1647, and was buried a few hours later in the graveyard of the Church of St Mary at Misley Heath, in an unmarked grave. It is thought that he was somewhere between 25 and 28 when he died. But local legend says he haunts both the bridge and the pond, especially on nights of a full moon. Ghosts are sometimes said to haunt lakes, pools and rivers, suggesting that the water acts as a portal between the living and the dead. The bricks we see today are what remains of the Hopping Bridge. The apparition of Hopkins, roughly 5 feet, wearing old-fashioned clothes, knee-high boots and a tall hat, is sometimes seen walking over the bridge and occasionally steps out onto the road, startling passing motorists. They stop their vehicles, but the mysterious pedestrian has vanished. He was witnessed by 2 fishermen one night who saw the figure clearly, only 10 feet from them. One of them swung their fishing rod around to try and poke him, but it passed straight through the figure. In terror, they dropped their equipment and ran. It is estimated that Hopkins was responsible for the deaths of around 400 people in East Anglia, including some males. Although Matthew Hopkins was successful in spreading fear and panic, his reputation declined rapidly due to a number of factors. Judges and clergy began to question his methods, particularly the use of torture. Hopkins's practice of charging towns for his services made people question whether he was simply a fraud. And in some areas, people began accusing Hopkins of witchcraft and questioning his past. The Hopkins trials were the peak of witch hysteria in Essex, but they also signalled the beginning of the end. By the 1660s, scepticism had grown and fewer trials resulted in executions. But do the ghosts of Hopkins and his tragic victims still exist to this day? I hope you enjoyed these stories of ghostly witches in the beautiful county of Essex. Initially, I was just going to make a video about ghosts in Essex, but I was completely struck by the sheer number of stories and locations linked to the dreadful witch trials from the past. There are more stories to come from this region, not just Essex, but East Anglia in general, and I hope to bring you more stories linked to witchcraft in the future. It is a fascinating subject, and it is also an absolute tragedy that so many innocent lives were lost this way. Today I have a few more details about the trials, some more stories, some myths and some postcards. If we just go back to the cage in St Osyth, as I was researching this video I discovered that Amy's Crypt, a channel I'm sure many of you will know, bought the cage in April, and I'm sure that Amy and Jared will find it an interesting place to live. I did read an article about it that said, Amy said, "We haven't owned the property for long, but have already had a number of experiences we aren't able to explain, mostly things like sounds or smells, but we've also had objects move on their own." So I just want to wish Amy and Jared all the best in their new home, the cage. One of the things that really struck me about the witch trials in Europe, the UK, and of course in Essex itself, was the scale of them. The numbers of people accused, imprisoned, convicted, and ultimately executed. I used the word hysteria in the video, but it's madness. It's baffling to me. I'm still trying to get my head around it, to be honest, and the statistics seem to vary, but we'll have a look at those in a moment. Matthew Hopkins, what a despicable person that man was, to actually watch innocent people with no real evidence take to the gallows and to make money from it. It's absolutely perplexing, the power that certain people can have. Peter C. Brown is the author of Essex Witches, and he suggests that in Europe, predominantly in the German-speaking regions, roughly 60,000 people were put to death by burning, and around 10 to 15% of those executed would have been men. And of course we can't forget Scotland. Scotland had huge swathes of witch trials, and although Scotland has only around a quarter of the population of England, it had 3 times the number of prosecutions, around 4,000 to 6,000 of witchcraft, and many of those would have been burned. And the Burning Times is the name given to the peak years between 1580 and 1662. And if you've ever stood on the esplanade at Edinburgh Castle and seen the Witches' Well, you can't help but be moved by the terrible events that took place just outside the castle. What an absolutely awful way to go. The last witch in England to be sent to the gallows is believed to be Alice Molland in Exeter in Devon in 1685. She was supposedly found guilty at the Exeter Assizes on the 20th of March for performing witchcraft on the bodies of Joanne Snow, Wilmot Snow and Alice Furs, but there are no surviving records of her trial or execution, so that is still a bit of a mystery. And in Scotland, the last accused, person of witchcraft to be executed was Janet Horne in 1727. Now, Janet Horne may not be her real name because in Scotland they use the name Janet Horne to refer to witches in Scotland, a bit like the American police use the term Jane Doe for unidentified female bodies. Now, this is a bit of a strange story, if I'm really honest. Janet was apparently married, but was likely suffering with dementia. She had a daughter who was unfortunately born with deformed hands and feet resembling a pony's hooves. The neighbours accused Horn of having used her daughter as a pony to ride to the devil, where he had put horseshoes on her. The trial was conducted very quickly. The sheriff, Captain David Ross, had judged both to be guilty and sentenced them to be burned at the stake. The daughter managed to escape, but Janet was stripped, smeared with tar, paraded through the town in a barrel and burned alive. 9 years after Janet's death, the Witchcraft Acts in Scotland were repealed, making executions for witchcraft unlawful. The last accused witch to be executed in Europe was in 1782 in Switzerland. And her name was Anna Goldie, and I do think it's worth having a look on YouTube. There are some very interesting videos about her. Very interesting case, very interesting execution. I'll leave you to go and have a look at that for yourselves. Let's go back to the beginnings in Essex. Elizabeth Lewis from Great Waltham in Essex was the first woman to be executed for witchcraft in England after the passing of the Witchcraft Act in 1563. In July 1564, at the Assizes in Colchester, she was indicted for bewitching to death a 3-month-old baby named John Woodley on the 15th of April. She was also indicted for bewitching to death the father of the baby on the 25th of April. And she was also indicted on the death of John Cannell, who died on May the 1st. I think he was a landowner. She was sentenced to death for murder by magic. Her execution was postponed because she falsely claimed to be pregnant. She was remanded in custody to await inspection by a matron who found her not pregnant, and so she was hanged. And it was this trial in Essex that really opened the floodgates for a period of really intense witchcraft persecutions in the county. The last person to be tried for witchcraft at the Assize Court was Elizabeth Ginn in 1675, when the charge against her was that she bewitched Edmund, the 9-year-old son of her neighbour Roger Tredder, to death. But this charge was dismissed, so she was not executed. In the book Essex Witches, Peter Brown talks a bit about Essex and how it was in the grip of a fever, a witch-finding fever in 1645. And he says that between 1560 and 1680, 317 women and 23 men were tried for witchcraft in Essex alone, and over 100 were hanged. But according to the Colchester and Ipswich museums, in Essex alone, around 1,000 people were accused of witchcraft from the 1500s to the 1800s, which is a staggering number. It's a very difficult subject to investigate records-wise. Some executions are well documented, but we have to remember that there were times where angry villagers would take it upon themselves, vigilante style, to execute suspected witches, so the numbers could be significantly higher. And it wasn't just women, there are records of men being executed too, although there were times when the men would be let off. When Ursula Kemp was tried in 1582, 4 cunning men were also charged with witchcraft, none of whom were hanged, and 2 were acquitted. A granite stone memorialising these tragic events is now located directly opposite Colchester Castle, which played an important role in the trials. Colchester Council granted permission for a plaque to be placed near the gates of Castle Park in remembrance of the victims of the witch trials, who were imprisoned at Colchester Castle. The final line reads, "This plaque is placed as a memorial to them all in the hope of an end to persecution and intolerance." I thought it was really interesting that George Pickingill had a blackthorn stick that was said to aid him. And that's actually the second time we've had a blackthorn stick in one of my videos. And blackthorn, it seems, has really important links to witchcraft. The Woodland Trust says blackthorn has long been considered a magical tree. In Celtic mythology, it was considered to be home to the fairies. It has been referred to as a witch's tree, and anyone carrying a walking stick made from blackthorn wood was suspected of being a witch. A blackthorn staff was thought to be effective for warding off evil spirits, and it is said that witches' wands were often made using blackthorn wood. Blackthorn trees are so named for their sharp thorns. Old witch lore claims both that the devil used one of these thorns to prick a would-be witch's finger before they signed his contract, and that witches would jab blackthorns into poppets to harm people. The opposite of blackthorn is hawthorn, which is a pagan symbol of fertility and has ancient associations with May Day. It was the ancestor of the maypole, and its leaves and flowers the source of May Day garlands. Hawthorn was never brought into the home. It was believed that bringing hawthorn blossom inside would be followed by illness and death. In medieval times, it was said that the hawthorn blossom smelled like the Great Plague, and that's probably why these flowers are associated with death. The first blackthorn stick we had in one of my videos was the haunted pubs of Edinburgh, and we had that bizarre case of Major Thomas Weir in the grass market. He had a blackthorn staff carved with a strange human head at the top. And whilst Weir was being burned for witchcraft, the stick was thrown onto the fire where it twisted and turned. Well, Essex has its very own witch stick in a museum in Finchingfield. It was discovered in an early 17th century cottage just near the village by the owner, Mr. Daniel Pedder, who found it buried within a wall. It was, he said, a witch's stick and used to beat suspected witches. I assume this is during interrogations. There is a story linked to the stick and a relative of Mr. Daniel Pedder. Mr. Pedder's great-great-grandmother's sister was beaten to death, accused of being a witch. Her name, apparently, was Goofy Mumford, and she was the local teacher in Finchingfield. It seems Goofy had been suspected of witchcraft, and the local villagers thought that she was teaching witchcraft to some of the local girls. And then there are two versions of the ending of the story. The first is that she was dragged outside of the cottage and physically beaten to death with the stick and also with stones, and that the local villagers did this. The second version is that Goofy Mumford, along with two other witches, were taken to a place called Howe Street, where there's a tiny crossroads, and they were all three stoned to death by villagers and buried at this exact crossroads that you can see in front of you here. Whether or not this stick was used in the assault, we don't know, but it's believed that it was bricked up into the home as a protective charm to ward off evil spirits from the house. Another stick was also found in the attic in the thatched roof, which is a fertility stick. This features butterflies, birds and serpents, and this was also thought to ward off evil spirits, and that is also in the Guildhall. There really are so many ghost stories and myths connected to witches throughout this region. I'm just really scratching the surface here. I've just got two postcards for you today, and the first was sent from Clacton-on-Sea to Cambridgeshire and was posted in 1973. It says, "Dear friends, the weather has been so kind to us and have nice bedroom to myself. There's 18 of us and good entertainment in the evenings. And a new coloured telly, so I will watch the wedding on Wednesday. Hope you are both well." And I thought, how exciting, what wedding might this be? And judging from the postmark of the 11th of November 1973, it was Anne, the Princess Royal, when she married Mark Phillips of the 1st Queen's Dragoon Guards. She got married on the 14th of November 1973, and the couple married at Westminster Abbey in a televised ceremony with an estimated audience of 100 million. So to see it in colour must have been very exciting for this lady, who I think is called Vi. Although their marriage ended in 1992, they did have 2 children, and Anne went on to marry again. And then I have this card from 1948. I will explain why I chose this in a moment. It's not very easy to read, but it says something like, "Very many happy returns, dear. Sorry I have not had time to write to you and Mother. We have had no time to. They have all been or went to Addiscombe yesterday." So this is a picture of the West Pier at Brighton, and I think I made a video about Brighton about 2 years ago. You may have seen it. And if you have seen it, you might remember that the West Pier had some absolutely horrific stories and was pretty much said to be cursed. It had deaths, fires, robberies. There was the death of 7 Navy personnel. It was just a catalogue of disaster, and some say it was truly cursed because when the fire happened, the only thing left was the tarot reading caravan. And today there's just virtually nothing left of it. I wanted to include this because it's kind of one haunted location going to another, because actually this postcard went to Canewdon in Essex. So that's it from me today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please feel free to like, share and subscribe to help the channel grow. I always appreciate it so much. Don't forget to come and find me on Instagram. And as ever, take care guys, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care.